Welcome back to another thrilling dive into the pop culture matrix. 2026 was supposed to be the ultimate reunion for the seven kings of K-pop. But what really happens when the crowns get heavy? Are they slowly falling apart under the crushing weight of their solo legacies, or are they actually evolving into something infinitely more savage? We are peeling back the illusions to uncover the raw, unfiltered reality of the new BTS era. Did the hiatus secretly break their legendary bond, or did it forge their brotherhood in absolute fire? Who is dominating the scene, and who has completely rewritten their destiny? Get ready, because the answers will shatter your expectations. Let's dive straight into Falling Apart or More Savage, 7 most dramatic facts of the new BTS era in 2026. Number 7. RM, the unforgiving leader, a crushing crown. Stepping into the brutal, unforgiving spotlight of 2026, Kim Namjoon, globally revered as RM, isn't just facing a highly anticipated musical comeback. He is standing at the volatile epicenter of a catastrophic identity collision, carrying a psychological burden so overwhelmingly heavy it would completely shatter a lesser man into a million irrecoverable pieces. When RM was finally discharged from his mandatory military service, the entire world collectively held its breath, expecting the familiar, comforting leader to emerge, the diplomatic anchor who could seamlessly stitch the 7 scattered pieces of the BTS puzzle back together with a few profoundly reassuring words and his trademark dimpled smile. But the stark, unvarnished reality hidden behind the heavily guarded, soundproof doors of HYBE's executive boardrooms tells a much darker, infinitely more savage story. Over the grueling past few years of their hiatus, Namjoon has evolved far beyond the restrictive boundaries of a polished K-pop idol, deeply immersing himself in the raw, unfiltered world of alternative indie music and the high-stakes, critically acclaimed contemporary art scene, cultivating an unapologetic, brutally honest solo persona that thrives on existential melancholy, stripped-down acoustics, and uncomfortable truths. So what exactly happens when a man who has finally found a fragile sense of peace in the quiet, dusty corners of obscure mountain art galleries and smoky underground late-night studio sessions is violently shoved back onto the glittering, hyper-manufactured, intensely scrutinized throne of the world's biggest pop phenomenon? The tension within the group is absolutely palpable, crackling in the air like electricity before a massive thunderstorm. Rumors leaking from inside the closely monitored camp suggest that the initial studio sessions for their monumental 2026 reunion album were less of a tearful, joyful homecoming and more of a tense, high-stakes standoff between 7 fully realized, dominant alpha artists who no longer need direction, let alone a leader to tell them how to sound. Imagine the agonizing, suffocating psychological friction RM is experiencing right now. He spent his entire youth sacrificing his own artistic ego, silencing his own creative desires to be the absolute unbreakable glue that held BTS together through every scandal and triumph. But now he is forced to herd a group of untouchable global titans: Jungkook, the unparalleled global pop prince; Jimin, the chart-topping ethereal sensation; Suga, the seasoned, hardened hip-hop maestro, who have all conquered the global charts on their own terms and established their own unshakable empires. Is Namjoon falling apart under the terrifying, creeping realization that his role as the legendary captain might be completely obsolete in this new era? Or is he brilliantly weaponizing this exact existential dread to forge a terrifyingly savage new era that will shock the industry to its core? Insider sources whisper that during a critical, intensely heated production meeting in late 2025, RM completely rejected the initial safe pop anthem demos proposed by the nervous label executives, violently slamming his lyric notebook on the mahogany table and demanding a massive, uncompromising pivot towards a darker, violently honest narrative that exposes the deep scars, the exhaustion, and the profound isolation of their hiatus. He is no longer playing the role of the polite, accommodating peacemaker who bows to corporate expectations. The 2026 RM is a ruthless, visionary artistic dictator, demanding that if BTS is to return to the world stage, they must brutally murder their past image and resurrect themselves from the ashes, entirely stripped of the glossy, easily digestible illusions of eternal youth. He is pouring his agonizing burnout, his identity crisis, and his profound disillusionment with the relentless, soul-crushing machine of the music industry directly into the group's new lyrics, creating a sonic landscape so aggressively raw and unfiltered that it has left executives sweating bullets and deeply terrified of the commercial implications. Have you ever felt the suffocating, heart-pounding pressure of having to pretend everything is perfectly fine and under control while you are secretly undergoing a massive, painful, and terrifying metamorphosis? That is the exact agonizing reality Namjoon is navigating right now, under the scrutiny of billions of eyes. He looks at his members during their highly publicized, meticulously choreographed reunion dinners, his eyes reflecting a heartbreaking, complex mix of immense brotherly pride and a chilling, isolating alienation, knowing that the innocent, hungry boys who shared a cramped, humid dorm in Nanhyeon-dong are dead and gone, replaced by multi-millionaire icons carrying their own massive, unyielding gravity. To survive this brutal 2026 era, RM has adopted a devastatingly savage defense mechanism. His rap delivery has dropped an entire octave, dripping with biting cynicism, dark sarcasm, and a terrifyingly calm authority that cuts through the beat like a surgical scalpel, while his public interviews have become intimidating masterclasses in cryptic philosophy, leaving seasoned journalists utterly baffled, intimidated, and desperately trying to decode his complex analogies about the beauty of decay and the illusion of forever. This is absolutely no longer the young man who delivered a comforting, universally beloved speech at the United Nations. This is a fiercely protective, battle-hardened veteran who has seen the absolute peak of the mountain, realized it is nothing but cold, barren, lonely rock, and is now boldly dragging his brothers through the freezing blizzard to find a brand new, undiscovered summit. He recognizes that holding on to the nostalgic golden days of the Dynamite and Butter era BTS is a fatal, catastrophic mistake, and his brutal push to redefine their legacy is sparking massive internal debates, with some critics and fans wondering if his unyielding high art demands are slowly fracturing their historic harmony, or if his radical, uncompromising vision is the literal only thing saving them from becoming a tragic, stagnant legacy act that desperately clings to past glories. Notice the way he carries himself now. Gone are the flashy, colorful, logo-heavy outfits of their Pop Prince days, entirely replaced by understated, meticulously tailored, dark monochrome silhouettes, often inspired by his favorite Korean dansekwa artists like Yoon Hyung-kun, perfectly mirroring the profound emptiness, the sophisticated maturity, and the quiet, dangerous storm of his current mindset. Every single late night spent alone in his meticulously curated studio archive, surrounded by rare, priceless art books, half-empty whiskey glasses, and the heavy, suffocating, deafening silence of immense global expectation, RM is literally rewriting the DNA of the biggest band in human history, completely and utterly indifferent to the massive backlash he might face from fans who are desperately begging for a return to the easy, happy, lucky days. Consider the profound, almost tragic existence of him. The man whose literal stage name used to stand for Rap Monster is now wrestling daily with the very real, terrifying monster of his own monumental, inescapable legacy. As he stands on the vast rehearsal stage, the massive stadium empty and echoing with the ghosts of their past tours haunting him, whispering insidious doubts into his ears, he is constantly asking himself, is it even physically and emotionally possible to recreate the world-stopping magic of the past, or is trying to do so a fool's errand that will inevitably lead to their spectacular, highly publicized downfall? When he interacts with Jin, the eldest, who has spent the last few years solidifying his status as a beloved, light-hearted national treasure, RM faces the stark, jarring contrast of their paths. Jin found lightness and joy, while RM plunged deeper into the heavy philosophical dark, exploring the ugliest parts of human emotion. Yet it is exactly this savage, unpredictable contrast that violently fuels the 2026 era, as RM masterfully blends Jin's effortless charisma, Suga's razor-sharp grit, H-Hope's intricate precision, Jimin's haunting elegance, V's soulful unpredictability, and Jungkook's boundless pop energy into a cohesive avant-garde masterpiece that violently defies every single conventional rule of K-pop. He refuses to let BTS become a nostalgic jukebox. He is pushing the vocalists to the absolute brink of their physical and emotional limits in the recording booth, demanding raw, unpolished, tear-stained vocal takes instead of the pitch-perfect, artificially sweetened verses the industry expects. The industry insiders are utterly terrified of this new unapologetic RM because he cannot be bought, he cannot be manipulated by social media trends, and he absolutely cannot be silenced by corporate expectations or fear of losing brand deals. He is a man who walks through the heavily guarded, sleek, futuristic corridors of the HYB building like an unstoppable phantom, carrying the sheer, unadulterated weight of millions of armies' hopes on his broad shoulders, while simultaneously plotting an artistic rebellion right under the powerful executives' noses. It is a breathtakingly dangerous tightrope walk over an abyss, balancing between commercial suicide and legendary artistic immortality. Will his incredibly savage, no-compromise attitude ultimately shatter the delicate, hard-fought brotherhood they have spent over a decade building, causing the band to violently splinter under the sheer, unmanageable pressure of his vision? Or will this intensely dark, intellectually complex iteration of BTS completely obliterate the global charts, leaving every other artist in the dust? Number 6. Suga, the Shadow Architect. A silent rebellion. Stepping out of the shadows and straight into the blinding, unforgiving crosshairs of the 2026 global music industry, Min Yoongi, the razor-sharp genius known to the world as Suga and feared by his competitors as the unstoppable August D, has completely transformed from a weary idle rapper into an absolute, uncompromising musical warlord whose very presence sends terrifying shivers down the spines of HYB's top corporate executives. When Yoongi concluded his grueling alternative military service, the media foolishly expected him to quietly slip back into his designated role as the group's introverted, gummy-smiling producer, churning out reliable, radio-friendly chart toppers to guarantee BTS's safe, heavily sanitized return to the mainstream pop throne. But the terrifyingly savage reality is that the man who walked back into the legendary Genius Lab is completely unrecognizable from the one who left it. During the deeply turbulent years of the hiatus, Yoongi tasted the intoxicating, unfiltered adrenaline of absolute artistic freedom. His monumentally successful solo tour as August D wasn't just a concert series, it was a brutal, violently honest exorcism of his deepest, darkest traumas, heavily proving to himself and the entire globe that he absolutely does not need the safety net of the BTS brand to effortlessly sell out massive stadiums worldwide. So what exactly happens when a fiercely independent, battle-scarred lone wolf who has completely conquered his inner demons and built an untouchable solo empire on raw rage and uncensored hip-hop grit is suddenly forced back into the highly restrictive, consensus-driven, densely populated pack of 7? The atmospheric tension radiating from Yoongi's heavily fortified, dimly lit studio is thick enough to cut with a rusted machete, as deeply guarded insider leaks suggest that he has initiated a ruthless, silent rebellion against the entire K-pop manufacturing machine, categorically refusing to write another superficial, sugar-coated, desperately happy pop anthem just to appease Western radio stations and greedy corporate shareholders. Imagine the suffocating, intensely claustrophobic psychological warfare raging inside his brilliant mind right now. He poured every ounce of his soul, his bleeding scars, his crushing past poverty, and his literal physical pain, immortalized by that infamous shoulder surgery, into deeply personal masterpieces like Amygdala, brutally tearing open his chest for the world to see. And now, society expects him to neatly pack all that profound, agonizing depth away into a shiny, commercially viable box just to film a brightly colored music video. Is Yoongi slowly falling apart under the infuriating, soul-crushing pressure to regress into a more palatable, easily digestible version of himself? Or is he masterfully weaponizing his terrifyingly blunt, famously unbothered attitude to single-handedly violently hijack the entire sonic direction of the 2026 reunion? Sources close to the production team whisper with absolute awe and sheer terror about the recent late-night recording sessions, describing a completely unyielding, terrifyingly demanding Suga sitting rigidly in his leather producer chair, his face entirely obscured by a dark bucket hat, ruthlessly forcing the group's elite vocalists, Jimin, Jin, and Jungkook, to record their verses dozens of times until their voices are literally cracking with genuine, unmanufactured exhaustion, desperately seeking that raw, imperfect, bloody human emotion that simply cannot be faked with auto-tune. Have you ever possessed a vision so vividly dark and overwhelmingly powerful that you are fully willing to burn down the entire established system, even your own historic legacy, just to see it come to life? That is the exact, breathtakingly dangerous path Min Yoongi is violently carving for BTS right now, functioning as the brutal, shadowy architect, operating perfectly in tandem with RM's philosophical vision, acting as the heavy, crushing hammer to Namjoon's sharp scalpel. While RM fights the intellectual battles in the boardroom, Suga is physically locking the studio doors, entirely cutting off communication with A&R executives and layering aggressive, skull-rattling underground boom-bop beats, distorted rock guitars, and traditional Korean instruments into a menacing, violently beautiful sonic tapestry that completely defies every single mathematical formula for a guaranteed TikTok viral hit. He is fiercely protecting the group's artistic integrity with the terrifying, savage ferocity of a cornered tiger, delivering notoriously short, brutally sarcastic, and devastatingly profound answers during their heavily publicized 2026 press conferences, completely dismantling lazy, probing journalists with a single, deeply unimpressed glare that immediately goes viral across every social media platform on the planet. This is not the quiet, sleepy Suga of 2018. This is a fully realized, immensely powerful 30-something maestro who has stared directly into the terrifying abyss of extreme global fame, crippling depression, and overwhelming burnout, and completely conquered it all, leaving him with an absolute, terrifying zero-tolerance policy for industry bullshit, fake smiles, and manufactured drama. He looks at the younger members with a fiercely protective older brother gaze, fully knowing the agonizing, bone-crushing toll this monumental comeback is taking on their physical bodies and fragile mental states, and he responds not with empty, comforting words, but with crafting violently defiant lyrics that spit fire directly at their critics, their stalkers, and the deeply toxic internet culture that constantly prays for their tragic downfall. Notice the stark, deliberate changes in his physical aura. The flashy, expensive designer streetwear has been completely replaced by simple, heavily worn-out vintage band tees, unkempt, shaggy hair, and an ever-present, dangerously cold stoicism that screams loud and clear that he absolutely does not care about charts, awards, or billionaire status anymore. Every single time he strikes a piano key or aggressively programs a drum machine late at night, fueled nothing but an iced Americano and the heavy, intoxicating burden of his own genius, he is daring the entire world to reject this new, deeply flawed, aggressively mature version of BTS, fully confident that true, enduring art can only be born from genuine, agonizing friction and total, unflinching honesty. The music industry is collectively holding its breath in sheer terror, deeply wondering if his unapologetic, fiercely combative attitude will alienate the massive, dedicated mainstream audience that desperately relies on BTS for pure, unadulterated escapism. But Suga simply smirks at the sheer absurdity of their panic. Will his dark, heavy, relentlessly savage musical architecture ultimately isolate the band from the very people who built their golden throne, slowly fracturing their historic global dominance? Or will his unapologetic, brutally raw authenticity prove to be the ultimate saving grace of the 2026 era, cementing Min Yoongi as the most dangerously brilliant, fearless, and ruthlessly uncompromising producer of his entire generation? Number 5. J-Hope, the Smiling Assassin, a Lethal Transformation. Stepping directly into the intensely suffocating, dangerously humid, and mirror-lined walls of the legendary Hybe dance studios in the hyper-scrutinized year of 2026, Jung Ho-sok, universally adored for a decade as the radiant sunshine and absolute moral compass of BTS, J-Hope has completely and utterly shed his bright, neon-colored, accommodating persona to become an absolutely terrifying, ruthlessly demanding performance dictator whose mere presence sends massive shockwaves of pure, unadulterated anxiety through the veins of even his most seasoned, globally celebrated bandmates. When Ho-sok first enlisted in the military, the entire world wept for the temporary loss of their ultimate serotonin boost, fondly remembering the vibrant man who constantly introduced himself as your hope. But the stark, chilling, and heavily guarded reality is that his prestigious, highly disciplined tenure as a terrifyingly strict assistant drill instructor in the army, perfectly combined with the massive, critically acclaimed underground success of his intensely dark, grunge-heavy solo masterpiece Jack in the Box and his historic, crowd-crushing, jaw-dropping Lollapalooza headlining set fundamentally rewired his entire artistic and psychological DNA into something infinitely more savage, deeply complex, and brutally unforgiving. So what exactly happens when the designated group mood maker, the ever-smiling, boundless, energetic core of the biggest band in the universe, suddenly metamorphosizes into a cold, calculating, flawlessly precise drill sergeant who views every single micromillimeter of a dance formation, every slight angle of a chin, and every half-second delay in a transition as a literal, unforgivable matter of life and death? The atmosphere inside the highly classified 2026 rehearsal room is described by terrified, whispering backup dancers and utterly exhausted senior choreographers as completely brutal, a high-stakes, breathless survival arena where J-Hope stands at the very front of the expansive room, his sharp, predatory eyes catching a single missed beat or a slightly bent wrist from the other 6 members in the reflection of the glass, punishing them not with loud, explosive screaming, but with a terrifyingly calm, chillingly polite, silent smile that universally demands they run the agonizingly complex, lung-busting 5-minute routine again from the very top, regardless of how much their muscles are screaming for mercy. Imagine the immense, bone-crushing physical and psychological pressure he is under right now. The members are absolutely no longer the spry, hyper-flexible, desperately hungry teenagers bouncing around a cramped, leaky garage in cheap sneakers. They are powerful, incredibly wealthy, heavily muscled men in their late 20s and early 30s, their aging bodies inevitably carrying the permanent, agonizing wear and tear, the chronic joint pain and hidden surgical scars of over a decade of gravity-defying, joint-destroying, superhuman choreography. Is Ho-sok slowly tearing the beloved group apart from the inside by ruthlessly demanding an impossible, utterly superhuman standard of physical perfection that their older bodies simply can no longer sustain without risking catastrophic, career-ending injuries? Or is he brilliantly, savagely pushing them miles beyond their own perceived mortal limits to absolute guarantee that their monumental, globe-stopping 2026 comeback performance completely obliterates every single competing rookie group in the industry and firmly reminds the world exactly why they are untouchable gods? Rumors swirling from the intensely stressed production crew suggest that during a particularly grueling, heavily tension-filled midnight rehearsal for their highly anticipated lead single, a visibly panting, completely drained Jungkook, the group's golden center, and a deeply fatigued, pale Jimin literally collapsed onto the cold, sweat-slicked hardwood floor, desperately begging for a 5-minute water break, only for J-Hope to quietly turn off the blaring music,
stare at them through the massive mirror with an emotionless, piercing, dead-eyed gaze and softly whisper that gravity absolutely does not care about their Billboard awards. The unforgiving stage will utterly consume them alive if they show even a fraction of a second of weakness, and true legends are forged when the body wants to die, but the mind refuses to quit. Have you ever felt the terrifying, ice-cold chill of completely realizing that the exact person who is fundamentally supposed to be your comforting safe haven has suddenly, without warning, become your most relentless, terrifyingly capable, and absolutely unyielding challenger? That is the exact awe-inspiring, profoundly terrifying dynamic J-Hope has forcibly injected straight into the beating heart of the 2026 era. He is no longer just hitting the beats with a joyful grin, he is violently commanding the rhythm, transforming entirely from a joyful, wide-eyed street dancer from the underground crews of Gwangju into an elite, unstoppable, hyper-focused, smiling assassin who views the stadium stage as a bloody, unforgiving battlefield where the absolute strongest and most impeccably prepared survive the slaughter. He knows deeply, in his very bones and heavily calloused feet, that the entire world is eagerly watching with bated breath, desperately waiting with their cameras ready for BTS to finally slip up, waiting for them to look slightly slower, slightly less synchronized, slightly out of breath after their long, highly publicized hiatus, and Hoseok has made it his absolute, uncompromising life mission to aggressively shove that deeply insulting narrative straight down the critics' throats until they choke on their own words. Notice the profound, intense, undeniable shift in his physical demeanor. The baggy, colorful, oversized streetwear has been entirely replaced with sleek, utilitarian, tightly fitted all-black rehearsal gear that perfectly accentuates his razor-sharp movements, his jawline noticeably sharper, his cheekbones hollowed from immense dedication, his eyes constantly burning with an obsessive, almost maniacal dedication to the craft that firmly borders on absolute terrifying insanity. Every single drop of sweat that forcefully hits the floor in that room is a physical, undeniable testament to his savage, unyielding philosophy that their monumental legacy absolutely cannot rely on the nostalgic, blind affection of their fans, but must be violently re-earned, reconquered, and forcefully taken back through pure, unadulterated blood, sweat, and agonizing tears every single time they dare to step into the blinding spotlight. The agonizing, deeply poetic irony of his current existence is that he is deliberately sacrificing his own mental peace, willingly isolating himself from the casual brotherhood, and carrying the massive, soul-crushing burden of being the universally feared bad guy in the room, strictly just to ensure his beloved brothers look like untouchable, immortal, perfectly synchronized deities when the blinding stadium lights finally hit their faces. He meticulously reviews hours of 4K rehearsal footage in the dead of night, frame by agonizing frame, isolating the tiniest, almost invisible imperfections, pausing and rewinding with the obsessive, maddening precision of a crazed scientist, completely ignoring the painful, throbbing ache in his own previously injured knees and ankles, because he simply refuses to let the pristine, flawless BTS brand tarnish even a fraction of a percent under his intense, suffocating watch. When he interacts with V, who naturally thrives on soulful, improvisational, unpredictable stage presence and loose emotion, the violent clash of their artistic philosophies is a violently beautiful, high-stakes spectacle. J-Hope brutally reins in V's free-spirited nature, aggressively chaining it to the rigid, mathematically perfect, hyper-synchronized beat, forcing a terrifyingly majestic hybrid of raw, dripping emotion and robotic, absolutely flawless physical execution that leaves onlookers completely breathless and utterly terrified of the final product. The industry insiders, veteran choreographers, and massive label executives are utterly mesmerized and deeply, profoundly terrified by this new, unapologetic, dictatorial J-Hope, because he has fully realized that the sheer, innocent joy of dancing is absolutely no longer enough to maintain their colossal global empire. It requires a ruthless, savage, almost predatory survival instinct to absolutely dominate the fiercely competitive competitive 2026 landscape? Will his incredibly brutal, punishing, intensely unforgiving rehearsal regime ultimately break their aging bodies, causing a catastrophic, highly publicized physical collapse and internal mutiny right before their massive, record-breaking world tour, completely validating the terrible, whispered fears that they are indeed falling apart at the seams? Or will this intensely dark, terrifyingly disciplined, flawlessly calculated iteration of J-Hope forge a live performance so overwhelmingly spectacular, so aggressively flawless, and so violently perfect that it instantly silences every single doubt, shatters every existing record, and completely redefines the very pinnacle of live entertainment, firmly solidifying Jungkook as the most dangerously brilliant, uncompromising, and savage performance director in the entire history of global pop music.
Number 4. Jin, the smiling anchor, a shattered mask. Stepping into the fiercely unpredictable, hyper-scrutinized battleground of 2026, Kim-sik Jin, universally celebrated as worldwide handsome and the perpetually light-hearted eldest brother of BTS, is facing a profoundly agonizing, deeply hidden psychological crisis that threatens to completely shatter the flawless, endlessly cheerful facade he has meticulously maintained for over a decade. When Jin became the very first member to conclude his mandatory military service, he was thrust into an incredibly daunting, uniquely terrifying position. He was left completely alone on the global stage, tasked with single-handedly carrying the colossal, suffocating weight of the entire BTS brand, while his younger brothers sequentially enlisted, a monumental burden he initially tackled with his signature dazzling smile, his infectious windshield wiper laugh, and a string of highly successful, delightfully quirky solo variety show appearances and beautifully tender acoustic pop releases like The Astronaut that deeply comforted millions of anxious, waiting fans. But the stark, violently contrasting, and heavily guarded reality behind the closed, soundproof doors of their 2026 reunion is that the man who patiently, loyally kept the massive, glowing lighthouse illuminated during their darkest, quietest years is now colliding head-first with an unrecognizable, terrifyingly intense, and aggressively dark sonic universe constructed by RM, Suga, and J-Hope, leaving him desperately wrestling with his own artistic identity and the agonizingly heavy, unspoken trauma of prolonged isolation. So what exactly happens when the universally beloved self-proclaimed mood maker, who spent years perfectly refining the absolute art of deflecting heavy emotional tension with a perfectly timed dad joke or a dramatically blown kiss, is suddenly forced to stare into the pitch black, violently existential abyss of their new, unapologetically savage era? The atmosphere whenever Jin steps up to the recording microphone in 2026 is described by tear-eyed, deeply moved studio engineers as utterly heartbreaking and terrifyingly raw, a high-stakes emotional tightrope where he is being violently pushed miles out of his comfortable, silver-voiced ballad zone and aggressively commanded by a relentless Yoongi to completely shred his pristine vocal cords, demanding a gritty, blood-stained rock delivery that physically hurts to produce and forces him to violently excavate the deepest, most painful corners of his soul. Imagine the crushing, suffocating internal paradox he is battling right now. He is the designated eldest, the traditional, deeply ingrained Korean symbol of unshakable stability, quiet strength, and comforting warmth for his 6 younger brothers, yet he is currently surrounded by a pack of fiercely independent, battle-hardened alpha wolves who have evolved far past the need for his
his gentle, protective coddling, leaving him deeply existentially questioning his fundamental purpose within the newly reformed group dynamic. Is Jin slowly falling apart, completely overwhelmed by the terrifying realization that his carefully constructed, incredibly effective coping mechanism of eternal optimism is entirely useless in this brutally honest, hyper-aggressive 2026 landscape? Or is he brilliantly, savagely weaponizing his massively underrated, genuinely terrifying acting chops to deliver a performance so profoundly, chillingly dark and layered that it will completely obliterate every single preconceived notion the industry has ever held about his capabilities? Rumors violently swirling through the elite echelons of the Korean entertainment industry suggest that during a highly classified, incredibly tense music video shoot for their 2026 comeback, the director specifically asked Jin to shed a single, perfectly aesthetic tear for a dramatic close-up, but instead, sick Jin completely broke off the meticulously planned script, staring completely dead-eyed into the massive, sweeping camera lens, his face entirely devoid of his usual radiant warmth, and delivered a gaze so incredibly hollow, so profoundly haunted by the heavy, unspoken ghosts of their grueling past, that it literally sent terrified shivers down the spine of the entire production crew and forced them to completely halt filming for over an hour. Have you ever felt the agonizing, suffocating pressure of being the only person holding a crumbling, heavy roof over everyone else's heads, perfectly smiling while your own knees are violently buckling and secretly bleeding under the immense, crushing weight? That is the exact awe-inspiring, profoundly tragic reality Jin is navigating right now, completely dropping his colorful, vibrant, boyish charm for a strikingly mature, dangerously quiet, and intensely sophisticated aura that screams of a man who has seen the absolute darkest sides of fame, loneliness, and corporate manipulation, and has actively chosen to survive it all through sheer, unadulterated willpower rather than naive optimism. He looks at Namjoon wrestling with the heavy crown of leadership, at Hoseok terrorizing the dance floor, at Yoongi fighting his underground wars, and Jin responds not with a comforting hug, but a terrifyingly cold, razor-sharp focus, entirely dedicating his agonizingly long, sleepless nights to violently reshaping his vocal technique, taking extensive, gruelingly painful vocal lessons to safely master the intense, raspy, throat-tearing belts required for their new heavy metal-infused rock-pop sound. Notice the profound, undeniable, and deeply unsettling shift in his public demeanor. The bright, pastel-colored sweaters and playful, exaggerated reactions on late-night talk shows have been entirely, ruthlessly replaced by tailored, structured dark suits, a piercing, unreadable, fiercely intelligent face, and a dangerously sharp, almost cynical wit that completely catches seasoned, aggressive interviewers off guard, proving once and for all that behind the handsome face lies an incredibly sharp, highly calculating, and deeply formidable mind that absolutely refuses to be underestimated or boxed into the visual category ever again. Every single soaring, aggressively powerful high note he hits in this new, unforgiving era is a massive, violent middle finger to every single critic who ever dared to label him as just a pretty face or the weakest vocal link in the group, proving with absolute, undeniable physical evidence that his vocal range is a devastatingly lethal weapon capable of completely destroying arenas and commanding the absolute, undivided attention of millions. The deeply poetic, agonizing irony of his current existence in 2026 is that the exact member who spent his entire 20s actively trying to soften the harsh, aggressive edges of the rap line is now deliberately, savagely sharpening his own blades, willingly plunging into the very darkness he used to protect them from, fully realizing that to conquer the massively evolved, brutally competitive music industry of today, they do not need a soft, comfortable comforting anchor. They need a heavily armored, battle-ready warship. When he interacts with the fiercely popular, globally dominating Maknae line, Jimin, V, and Jungkook, the dynamic has completely, violently shifted from a playful, indulgent older brother to a hardened, intensely demanding veteran who expects absolutely nothing less than absolute perfection, pushing them to completely abandon their comfortable solo habits and re-assimilate into the fiercely tight, unified, heavily synchronized military-like precision of the group. The industry insiders, veteran vocal coaches, and massive global media outlets are completely mesmerized and deeply, profoundly terrified by this new, unapologetic, intensely serious sick Jin, because he has fully realized that true, enduring global dominance cannot rely solely on viral charm and a handsome face. It requires a ruthless, savage, intensely emotional vulnerability that violently tears down the wall between the artist and the audience. Will his incredibly painful, intensely grueling vocal transformation and his chillingly dark, dramatic new persona ultimately break his spirit, causing a catastrophic, highly publicized emotional burnout that completely shatters the fragile illusion of their perfect reunion, validating the terrible whispered fears that the group is fundamentally falling apart at the seams? Or will this intensely dark, terrifyingly focused, flawlessly executed iteration of Jin forge a musical performance so overwhelmingly spectacular, so aggressively powerful, and so violently perfect that it instantly silences every single doubt, completely redefines his entire legacy, and firmly solidifies Kim Sik-jin as the most dangerously versatile, emotionally profound, and savage dark horse in the entire history of global pop music?
Number 3. Jimin, the Black Swan, a lethal seduction. Stepping gracefully yet dangerously into the hyper-scrutinized, fiercely competitive, and entirely unforgiving global arena of 2026, Park Jimin, globally worshipped for over a decade as the ethereal, angelic, high-hitting vocalist and the mesmerizing, gravity-defying contemporary dancer of BTS, has completely and utterly shattered his delicate, universally adored soft mochi persona to violently resurrect himself as an unapologetically dark, intensely seductive, and terrifyingly captivating performance siren who is leaving both veteran industry critics and absolutely mesmerized fans gasping for air. When Jimin quietly enlisted in the military alongside Jungkook in their highly publicized companion deployment, serving grueling months in a heavy artillery division, the world anxiously wondered if the harsh, unyielding, freezing conditions of the front lines would permanently damage his notoriously fragile, incredibly unique vocal cords, or stiffen his breathtakingly fluid, balletic body. But the chilling, intensely savage reality that emerged from those heavily guarded barracks is a man who didn't just survive the brutal discipline, but completely absorbed it, violently transforming his former elegant vulnerability into a razor-sharp, lethal weapon of mass artistic seduction. Over the deeply transformative hiatus, specifically fueled by the massive, historic, chart-topping success of his raw, emotionally bleeding solo albums Face and Muse, Jimin tasted the intoxicating, deeply liberating thrill of fully stripping away the heavy, suffocating layers of idle perfection, aggressively confronting his darkest, most suffocating inner demons, his crippling bouts of self-doubt, and his agonizing, isolating search for true identity in a world that constantly demands manufactured happiness. So, what exactly happens when a man who has spent his entire adult life desperately contorting his physical body and severely restricting his own diet to perfectly fit the impossible, heavily sanitized mold of a pristine pop prince, suddenly decides to completely embrace the shadows, violently tearing down the very pedestal the industry placed him on? The atmospheric tension whenever Jimin enters the dim, intensely pressurized 2026 recording studio is described by completely awestruck producers as intoxicatingly heavy, deeply haunting, and dangerously unpredictable. He is absolutely no longer strictly relying on those safe, sweet, breathy falsettos that effortlessly dominated daytime radio, but is instead aggressively plunging into the absolute gritty, terrifying depths of his lower register, desperately demanding to record his verses with a raw, unpolished, almost agonizingly raspy texture that sounds less like a perfectly packaged K-pop idol and infinitely more like a deeply wounded, fiercely defiant rock star who has literally crawled back from the absolute brink of hell. Imagine the crushing, bone-deep, profoundly suffocating psychological and physical warfare raging inside his mind and body right now. He is actively carrying the massive, compounding physical trauma of years of extreme, joint-destroying contemporary choreography, secretly battling the agonizing chronic muscle pains and the terrifying, whispered industry rumors of severe vocal cord nodules caused by a decade of singing vastly outside his natural range. Yet he absolutely refuses to show even a micromillimeter of weakness to his aggressively evolving brothers. Is Jimin slowly, tragically falling apart under the terrifying, creeping realization that his aging, battered body might eventually betray his relentlessly ambitious, violently perfectionist mind, slowly cracking the beautiful, fragile porcelain doll image that made him a global icon? Or is he brilliantly, savagely weaponizing his very real, documented pain to deliver a live performance so violently emotional, so deeply unapologetically erotic, and so completely mesmerizing that it totally rewrites the fundamental rules of stage presence? Insider sources desperately leaking information from HYB's highly classified, heavily guarded midnight choreography sessions paint a truly breathtaking, intensely intimidating picture. While J-Hope barks brutal, mathematically precise orders, Jimin is the one violently pushing the actual boundaries of human expression, deliberately modifying the group's aggressively sharp new dance routines to inject a deeply unsettling, fluid, almost predatory sensuality. His eyes entirely devoid of their signature eye smile, replaced instead by a piercing, dead serious, intensely hungry gaze that literally completely paralyzes anyone unfortunate enough to catch it in the mirror's reflection. Have you ever possessed a burning, desperate desire to be seen for your true, flawed, deeply complex self so intensely that you are fully willing to completely destroy the beautiful, lucrative lie everyone fell in love with? That is the exact, awe-inspiring, profoundly dangerous tightrope Jimin is walking right now, serving as the intensely emotional, deeply chaotic, artistic counterweight to the group's newly militaristic precision, deliberately wearing heavily deconstructed, gender-fluid, dark, high-fashion couture that aggressively blurs the lines between masculine aggression and feminine grace, instantly turning every single airport arrival and heavily guarded press conference into his own personal, avant-garde runway of silent rebellion. He looks at Jungkook, his former partner in crime, who has now fully evolved into an untouchable global pop titan, and instead of shrinking into the massive, imposing shadow of the golden maknae, Jimin violently matches his energy, pushing their legendary, highly intricate stage interactions away from playful brotherly teasing and straight into a fiercely competitive, violently intense, almost theatrical standoff that leaves screaming stadium crowds utterly, completely breathless and deeply questioning everything they thought they knew about their dynamic. Notice the profound, deliberate, terrifyingly calculated shift in the way he commands the stage in this new era. The soft, comforting gestures have been entirely ruthlessly replaced by sharp, calculated, aggressive isolation movements. His incredibly famous hair styled in a messy, wet grunge look, completely embracing the heavy sweat, the exhaustion, and the raw, unadulterated grit of a man who is literally dancing as if his very survival depends on perfectly hitting the final beat.
every single time he violently throws his body to the unforgiving stage floor, completely ignoring the screaming protests of his heavily taped joints. He is screaming a massive, undeniable declaration of war against the toxic, hypercritical internet culture that constantly tried to police his body, his weight, his gender expression, and his vocal capabilities, proving with absolute, undeniable physical dominance that he is not a fragile piece of glass waiting to be broken, but a terrifyingly sharp, lethal shard completely capable of drawing blood. The deeply poetic, wildly agonizing irony of his current 2026 existence is that the exact member who historically struggled the absolute most with his self-image, desperately chasing an impossible standard of flawless beauty, has now violently discovered his absolute maximum power in his very imperfections, willingly embracing the dark, the messy, the loud, and the uncomfortable to perfectly complement RM's heavy philosophical lyrics and Suga's skull-rattling beats. When the blinding, massive stadium lights hit his face during the climax of their new, intensely heavy rock-infused single, he does not smile. He delivers a chilling, knowing, utterly dominant smirk that instantly sends absolute shockwaves through the massive audience, fundamentally proving that true, enduring magnetism absolutely cannot be manufactured in a boardroom, but is forged entirely in the dark, lonely fires of extreme self-doubt and agonizing rebirth. The industry executives, elite choreographers, and massive global media are completely spellbound and deeply, profoundly terrified by this new, unapologetic, intensely seductive Park Jimin, because he has fully realized that to conquer the massively evolved, brutally chaotic 2026 musical landscape, he doesn't need to be their sweet, comforting angel anymore. He needs to be their absolute, inescapable, brilliantly savage obsession. Will his incredibly punishing, intensely grueling physical demands and his chillingly dark, emotionally exhausting new persona ultimately break his body, causing a catastrophic, highly publicized physical collapse that completely validates the terrible, whispered fears that they are literally tearing themselves apart for the sake of the comeback? Or will this intensely dark, terrifyingly confident, flawlessly dangerous iteration of Jimin forge a legacy so overwhelmingly spectacular, so aggressively passionate, and so violently perfect that it instantly silences every single doubt, completely obliterates all remaining competition, and firmly solidifies him as the most dangerously brilliant, emotionally profound, and savage performer in the entire history of the entertainment world?
Number 1. Jungkook, the Golden Titan, a global domination. Stepping onto the absolute peak of the modern music industry's most terrifying, hyper-scrutinized, and relentlessly demanding summit in the monumental year of 2026, Jungkook, universally worshipped by billions as the Golden Maknae and the unstoppable, record-breaking main vocalist of BTS, has completely and violently obliterated every single lingering trace of his innocent, wide-eyed teenage boy band image to aggressively ascend as an untouchable, fiercely independent global pop titan whose sheer, unadulterated commercial and artistic power currently rivals and in many cases completely eclipses the absolute biggest Western superstars on the entire planet. When Jungkook concluded his grueling military service alongside Jimin in their highly publicized companion deployment, the global media was completely on fire with one massive anxiety-inducing question. How on earth does a man who just single-handedly conquered the Billboard 100, shattered Spotify streaming records, and dominated global pop culture with his incredibly massive, undeniably iconic solo-era Golden, willingly step back into the incredibly restrictive, heavily structured formation of a 7-member group without completely suffocating his massively evolved, God-tier superstar aura? The stark, chilling, and heavily guarded reality behind the highly anticipated 2026 reunion is that the young boy who once cried in the dark because his older brothers were exhausted has completely transformed into a hardened, battle-tested, incredibly lethal industry apex predator who does not just sing the chorus, but violently commands the entire atmospheric gravity of any stadium he dares to step foot inside. So what exactly happens when the undeniable center of the group, a heavily tattooed, fiercely confident, motorcycle-riding, lip-pierced pop king who literally tastes the intoxicating thrill of absolute, uncontested, solo world domination, is suddenly forced back into the intense, heavily negotiated, aggressively democratic creative process orchestrated by RM and Suga? The atmospheric tension whenever Jungkook grabs the microphone in the heavily fortified Hybe studios is described by utterly terrified and completely mesmerized music executives as a dangerously beautiful, high-stakes collision of absolute musical titans. He is no longer the incredibly talented kid eagerly waiting for his vocal cues, but a fully realized, aggressively dominant maestro who perfectly understands the exact, terrifying millimeter of his vocal range, violently demanding to push the group's sonic boundaries into a heavy, dark, incredibly seductive pop R&B hybrid that specifically caters to his massive, mature global audience. Imagine the incredibly massive, bone-deep, profoundly suffocating psychological and physical pressure he is navigating right now. He is actively carrying the terrifying, colossal expectation of being the main bridge between BTS's historic K-pop legacy and the absolute pinnacle of mainstream global pop culture, fiercely battling the whispered, incredibly toxic industry rumors that he has simply grown too big for the band, that his overwhelming, blinding star power is slowly, inevitably fracturing the group's legendary dynamic and turning the other 6 members into his highly glorified backup dancers. Is Jungkook slowly, tragically tearing the beloved brotherhood apart from the inside by completely outgrowing the very foundational concept of BTS, falling apart under the terrifying realization that his own massive, unprecedented solo success might be the exact weapon that destroys the group's delicate balance? Or is he brilliantly, savagely weaponizing his monumental, undeniable global dominance to violently, forcefully drag the biggest pop band on the planet up to an entirely new, completely unreachable God-tier stratosphere? Insider sources desperately leaking highly classified information from their incredibly intense late-night choreography sessions paint a truly breathtaking, heavily intimidating picture. While J-Hope barks brutal, mathematically precise orders, Jungkook completely absorbs the agonizing physical punishment with a chilling, dead-eyed smirk, aggressively matching the intense militaristic precision with an incredibly loose, highly intoxicating, dangerously arrogant Western pop swagger that completely hypnotizes the mirror, perfectly blending the rigid, flawless discipline of K-pop with the raw, unscripted, wildly unpredictable sexual energy of a massive stadium-touring rock star. Have you ever possessed an absolute, undeniable, world-conquering talent so incredibly massive that your mere presence threatens to completely eclipse the very people you love the most, forcing you to constantly, agonizingly modulate your own blinding light just to keep the family together? That is the exact awe-inspiring, profoundly dangerous tightrope Jungkook is casually walking right now, serving as the incredibly explosive, intensely chaotic, and aggressively powerful commercial engine of the group's highly anticipated 2026 comeback, deliberately replacing his former safe, youthful stage outfits with heavily distressed, custom-tailored leather jackets that aggressively expose his massive, intricate sleeves of tattoos, fully embracing the heavy sweat, the exhaustion, and the raw, unadulterated grit of a man who has completely conquered his own worst fears and now absolutely refuses to apologize for his monumental, world-ending success.
He looks at Namjoon wrestling with the heavy crown of leadership, at Yoongi fighting his underground wars, at Jin pushing his vocal limits, at Hosek terrorizing the dance floor, at Jimin violently seducing the camera, and at V completely rebelling against the system, and Jungkook perfectly matches every single one of their intense theatrical energies with a terrifyingly effortless, completely dominant smirk, pushing their legendary stage dynamic into an aggressively mature, deeply captivating, violently competitive visual feast that leaves screaming crowds completely breathless and absolutely begging for mercy. Notice the profound, deliberate, terrifyingly calculated shift in the way he fundamentally commands the stadium in this new, unforgiving era. The playful, innocent bunny smiles have been entirely, ruthlessly replaced by a slow, knowing, incredibly dangerous gaze, a deeply intense, heavily breathing, violently charismatic aura that completely penetrates through the massive stadium screens, heavily proving with absolute, undeniable physical evidence that he is no longer just the golden maknae of a Korean boy band, but the absolute, uncontested golden emperor of the entire global music industry. Every single time he deliberately unleashes that impossible, flawlessly, perfectly pitched, aggressively powerful high note during the absolute climax of their new heavy metal-infused lead single, entirely ignoring the desperate, breathless screams of the 80,000 fans surrounding him, he is screaming a massive, undeniable declaration of loyalty to his brothers, proving to the entire world that despite the toxic, desperate attempt to divide them, his massive, world-conquering solo crown actually heavily belongs to the very group that raised him from the ground up. The deeply poetic, wildly agonizing irony of his current 2026 existence is that the exact member that the industry desperately tried to poach, desperately tried to isolate, and desperately tried to turn into a standalone solo cash cow has now violently become the absolute, unbreakable, fiercely loyal bedrock of their entirely chaotic new era, willingly pouring every single ounce of his massive, hard-earned global influence directly back into the beating heart of BTS. When the blinding, massive stadium lights finally hit his face, covered in heavy sweat and completely out of breath, he does not rely on manufactured idle charm. He simply stands there, heavily projecting an incredibly chilling, entirely dominant, fiercely protective aura that instantly sends absolute shockwaves of pure, undeniable awe through the massive global audience, fundamentally proving that true power is not just about conquering the world alone, but violently dragging your entire family to the absolute peak of the mountain with you. The massive industry executives, veteran music critics, and heavily invested global media outlets are completely spellbound and deeply, profoundly terrified by this new, unapologetic, intensely powerful Jungkook, because he has fully realized that to utterly conquer the massively evolved, brutally chaotic 2026 musical landscape, the group absolutely does not need to fear his massive success. They just need to violently strap in and let him completely shatter the sonic barrier. Will his incredibly massive, intensely demanding global superstar status and his chillingly confident, emotionally overwhelming new persona ultimately completely overshadow his brothers, causing a catastrophic, highly publicized internal fracture that completely validates the terrible, whispered fears that they are simply falling apart under the weight of his golden crown? Or will this intensely dark, terrifyingly confident, flawlessly powerful iteration of Jungkook forge a deeply emotional, overwhelmingly spectacular musical legacy?
Number 2. V. The Elite Warrior, a Soulful Mutiny. Stepping out of the grueling, heavily armored, completely unforgiving shadows of the Republic of Korea Army's absolute elite special duty team, Kim Tae-young, globally mesmerized by millions as the incredibly enigmatic, deep-voiced visual powerhouse V of BTS, has violently shattered every single preconceived notion of his quiet, eccentric, good boy persona to emerge as a terrifyingly disciplined yet fundamentally rebellious, soulful maverick whose unpredictable energy is currently sending massive, unmanageable shockwaves through the meticulously organized HYBE executive boardrooms in the hyper-scrutinized year of 2026. When Tae-young voluntarily enlisted in the notoriously dangerous, physically brutal anti-terrorism unit, famously known as the SDT, wearing the heavy black uniform and carrying lethal tactical gear, the entire world was left completely speechless, deeply terrified for the safety of the man who previously spent his free time wandering through vintage Parisian art galleries, passionately listening to old vinyl jazz records, and casually directing incredibly moody, heavily romantic independent film concepts for his critically acclaimed, highly successful solo masterpiece, Layover. But the stark, chilling, and heavily guarded reality behind the highly anticipated 2026 reunion is that the man who survived extreme, life-threatening tactical combat training has returned not with a desire for easy, manufactured pop stardom, but with an uncompromising, dangerously sharp, and fiercely independent artistic vision that entirely rejects the highly synthetic, mathematically perfected algorithms of the modern K-pop industry. So what exactly happens when the group's ultimate unpredictable wildcard, a deeply emotional, profoundly old-school romantic who literally breathes through slow, haunting saxophone melodies and melancholic, smoky baritone jazz vocals, is violently shoved back into the incredibly loud, hyper-aggressive hip-hop and rock-infused sonic apocalypse currently being architected by RM and Suga? The atmospheric tension whenever V casually strolls into the heavily pressurized million-dollar recording studio is described by completely awestruck and deeply stressed sound engineers as a violently beautiful, high-stakes cinematic standoff, while the producers desperately try to hand him auto-tuned, fast-paced vocal guides. Tae-young completely ignores the glowing digital monitors, entirely closing his eyes, firmly grasping the vintage condenser microphone and deliberately dragging the tempo completely off beat, injecting a raw, dripping, deeply sensual R&B groove that physically forces the entire production team to completely scrap their expensive, perfectly timed beats and organically follow his breathtakingly soulful, entirely improvisational lead. Imagine the incredibly massive, bone-deep, profoundly suffocating psychological friction he is navigating right now. He spent years mastering the terrifyingly rigid, flawlessly synchronized choreography that J-Hope strictly demands, yet his fundamental soul desperately craves the absolute unrestricted freedom to just stand perfectly still under a single dramatic old Hollywood spotlight, allowing the sheer terrifying gravity of his incredibly deep, raspy voice and his intensely piercing, deeply melancholic gaze to completely paralyze a stadium of 80,000 screaming fans without moving a single heavily rehearsed muscle. Is Tae-young slowly, tragically drifting away from the group's highly unified, intensely synchronized core identity, entirely falling apart under the terrifying realization that his deep, undeniable love for classic, unstructured vintage artistry completely contradicts the massive, heavily manufactured forward-moving machine of the BTS global empire? Or is he brilliantly, savagely weaponizing his completely undeniable, magnetic, and fiercely independent aura to violently force the biggest pop band on the planet to fundamentally mature into sophisticated, untouchable musical legends? Insider sources
creators desperately leaking information from their heavily classified, incredibly tense late-night strategy meetings paint a truly breathtaking, intensely intimidating picture. During a massive debate regarding their 2026 World Tour set list, V reportedly stood up, completely unbothered by the frantic label executives waving massive data sheets about streaming algorithms and TikTok retention rates, and calmly, heavily demanded that they entirely replace a massive, heavily choreographed EDM dance break with a completely raw, unscripted, 5-minute live brass and acoustic guitar jam session, fully willing to completely alienate the casual, trend-chasing listeners just to prove to the entire world that they are absolutely not a manufactured boy band anymore, but world-class, undeniable musicians. Have you ever possessed a deeply ingrained, almost agonizingly powerful sense of artistic integrity so incredibly strong that you are completely willing to stare directly into the eyes of the most powerful corporate billionaires in the music industry and absolutely refuse to compromise a single note of your soul? That is the exact awe-inspiring, profoundly dangerous tightrope V is casually walking right now, serving as the intensely emotional, deeply chaotic, and aggressively romantic counterweight to the group's newly militaristic precision, deliberately replacing his former colorful, eccentric idol wardrobe with heavily tailored, slightly disheveled, incredibly expensive vintage designer suits, aggressively blurring the lines between a hardened, battle-tested military veteran and a heartbroken, chain-smoking 1950s jazz crooner, instantly turning every single paparazzi photograph into a literal masterpiece of cinematic high-fashion rebellion. He looks at Jimin, who is violently pushing the boundaries of lethal seduction, and perfectly matches that intense theatrical energy with a slow, deliberate, terrifyingly confident dominance, pushing their legendary stage dynamic into an aggressively mature, deeply captivating visual feast that leaves screaming crowds completely breathless and absolutely begging for mercy. Notice the profound, deliberate, terrifyingly calculated shift in the way he fundamentally interacts with the camera in this new, unforgiving era. The playful, innocent, boxy smiles and the heavily practiced, cute V signs have been entirely, ruthlessly replaced by a slow, knowing, incredibly dangerous smirk, a deeply intense, unblinking stare that completely penetrates through the massive stadium screens, intensely embracing the raw, unadulterated grit of a man who has literally stared danger in the face, completely conquered his own worst fears, and now absolutely refuses to play the safe, heavily sanitized game of a typical idol. Every single time he deliberately drops his voice into that impossible, deeply resonant lower register, entirely ignoring the desperate screams of the vocal coaches who want him to belt higher, he is screaming a massive, undeniable declaration of war against the incredibly toxic, ageist industry that constantly tries to force grown men to forever act like innocent teenagers, proving with absolute, undeniable physical evidence that true, enduring magnetism absolutely cannot be manufactured by an agency, but is forged entirely in the dark, lonely fires of extreme self-discovery and absolute, unyielding authenticity. The deeply poetic, wildly agonizing irony of his current 2026 existence is that the exact member who was once famously referred to as a hidden, unpredictable alien by the public has now violently become the absolute, grounded, soulful, emotional anchor of their entirely chaotic new sound, willingly embracing the dark, the melancholic, the beautifully tragic, and the deeply uncomfortable realities of adulthood to perfectly contrast RM's aggressive intellect and Jungkook's boundless pop energy. When the blinding, massive stadium lights finally hit his face during the absolute climax of their new, incredibly dramatic cinematic lead single, he does not rely on flashy choreography. He simply stands there, heavily projecting an incredibly chilling, entirely dominant, fiercely independent aura that instantly sends absolute shockwaves of pure, unadulterated awe through the massive global audience, fundamentally proving that true power does not always roar. Sometimes it simply whispers right into your soul and refuses to let go. The massive industry executives, veteran music critics, and heavily invested global media outlets are completely spellbound and deeply, profoundly terrified by this new, unapologetic, intensely soulful Kim Tae-young, because he has fully realized that to utterly conquer the massively evolved, brutally chaotic 2026 musical landscape, he absolutely does not need to conform to their heavily restricted, brightly colored box. He simply needs to entirely rewrite the very definition of what a global pop star is allowed to be. Will his incredibly stubborn, intensely demanding artistic rebellion and his chillingly dark, emotionally overwhelming new persona ultimately completely isolate him from his brothers, causing a catastrophic, highly publicized internal mutiny that completely validates the terrible whispered fears that they have simply grown too big, too different, and too fiercely independent to ever truly function as a cohesive unit again?
Stepping back from the absolute edge of this terrifyingly beautiful, intensely chaotic, and profoundly mesmerizing 2026 abyss, the ultimate, undeniably massive question that has been violently haunting the heavily sleep-deprived minds of billions of fans, elite industry critics, and trembling corporate executives finally, brutally demands an answer. Is the legendary, historic, world-conquering entity known as BTS truly falling apart under the massive, suffocating, bone-crushing weight of their individual superstar egos? Or have they simply, savagely evolved into an entirely new, completely untouchable, god-tier stratosphere of artistic immortality? When you fiercely examine the breathtaking, heavily bruised, fiercely independent, and aggressively mature paths that Namjoon, Yoongi, Hosek, Sekjin, Jimin, Taeyoung, and Jungkook have ruthlessly carved out during their agonizingly long, deeply transformative hiatus, the chilling, overwhelmingly powerful reality completely shatters every single fragile, nostalgic illusion you ever held about their highly anticipated return. They are absolutely, unequivocally not the same innocent, desperately hungry, brightly colored teenagers who once openly wept for a single music show win in cramped, humid, deeply claustrophobic waiting rooms back in 2013. Those boys have been deliberately, violently, and respectfully laid to rest, permanently buried beneath a colossal, unyielding mountain of broken Billboard records, completely shattered streaming algorithms, heavily sold-out massive stadium tours, and the thick, intoxicating ashes of their own monumental, fiercely independent solo empires. What we are witnessing right now, in real time, bleeding across heavily fortified recording studios, intensely stressful boardroom meetings, and blindingly bright, globally broadcasted stadium stages, is absolutely not a tragic, highly publicized internal collapse, but a ruthless, meticulously orchestrated, wildly terrifying, and deeply poetic artistic mutiny against the very heavily manufactured, fiercely restrictive industry that originally birthed them. Have you ever fully considered the incredibly dark, deeply agonizing, profoundly existential, and heavy emotional cost of having to completely destroy your own historic, universally beloved, and immensely profitable legacy just so you can finally breathe, bleed, and exist as a fully realized, deeply flawed, aggressively authentic human being in front of the entire unforgiving world? That is the exact awe-inspiring, intensely violent masterpiece the 2026 era of BTS is aggressively painting across the global cultural landscape, proving with absolute, undeniable, fiercely physical evidence that true, enduring brotherhood is not about blindly suppressing your own blinding individual light just to fit perfectly back into a safe, comfortable, highly sanitized corporate box, but about violently dragging your six fierce
fiercely loyal brothers into the absolute darkest, most terrifying depths of your own soul, exposing your ugliest, most bleeding scars, and trusting them entirely to help you fiercely fight your way back to the surface as an unstoppable, completely unified, seven-headed hydra. The heavily whispered, desperately toxic rumors of their impending demise have been completely, brutally silenced by a unified sonic roar so aggressively raw, so intensely emotional, so heavily saturated with genuine, unadulterated blood, sweat, and agonizing tears, and so violently perfect that it has instantly rendered every single other pop act on the planet completely, utterly obsolete, firmly cementing the undeniable, breathtaking truth that the seven kings of global pop did not simply return to politely reclaim their old comfortable throne. They forcefully returned to entirely, ruthlessly burn the old kingdom to the ground and aggressively build a terrifyingly massive, utterly untouchable new empire directly on top of its smoking, heavily charred ruins. Will the incredibly unforgiving, hypercritical global audience, deeply addicted to easily digestible, bite-sized viral trends, be able to mentally and emotionally survive this intensely dark, terrifyingly confident, flawlessly savage, and brutally honest iteration of the biggest band in human history? Or will the sheer, unadulterated, blinding gravity of their combined God-tier evolution simply prove to be completely overwhelmingly too massive for the fragile mainstream world to fully comprehend? One absolutely chilling, heavily undeniable fact remains fiercely crystal clear as we aggressively brace ourselves for the monumental, globe-stopping, unprecedented tidal wave of their new era. BTS is absolutely, fundamentally not falling apart. They are violently, beautifully, and unapologetically coming together to unleash the most aggressively savage, emotionally profound, and historically indestructible musical domination the known universe has ever witnessed, and absolutely no one, not the media, not the industry, and perhaps not even their most fiercely devoted fans, is truly, completely prepared for the breathtakingly beautiful, world-shattering artistic slaughter that is about to permanently rewrite the very fabric of music history.